Joining us this morning is, I'll just do our partner first, Peter Schablik, the partner in the Boston office who specializes in IT, systems implementation, systems selection, and is really an expert, and he'll introduce himself a little bit more when we get started. We're really delighted this morning to have Richard Andreano, a practice leader in the mortgage banking group of Ballard, Spahr, and CohnReznick has. We're very pleased that he's able to take the time this morning, but Richard is going to be our first speaker, and he has been on the ground with CFPB from the beginning. His practice is directed to lenders, and he has a wealth of information regarding the new disclosures, as well as all the matters related to compliance, and in particular the CFPB. He's been on many panels of the Mortgage Bankers Association, and I'm sure you have had the pleasure of meeting him and seeing his presentations. Richard is going to start off our presentation this morning, and then I'll do a PowerPoint slide, and then Peter Schablik will do a PowerPoint slide, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. And again, this is a rare opportunity to have Rich, to be able to chat with him regarding some of these issues. Richard, if you would kick us off this morning.
Yes, thank you very much, Roberta, and good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us. I'm going to go over just a few different points, more operational type points, after first addressing one more legal issue that was presented by the rule, and that is liability. What the Bureau decided to do when Congress directed them to integrate the RESPA and TILA disclosures, but really didn't give them a whole lot of guidance of how to go about doing that. One of the first things they had to come up with is where were they going to place all of these requirements. What they decided to do is actually place them within the regulations under the Truth in Lending Act, Regulation Z, which immediately gave some concern to the industry. Did this mean now suddenly that not only were truth in lending requirements subject to damages under the Truth in Lending Act, but also now were RESPA disclosures? Because one very interesting thing, while we know there is various types of liability under truth in lending for the disclosure requirements, an interesting thing with the RESPA provisions is there was no private right of action for the various disclosure requirements. Certainly there was administrative liability, and some plaintiffs' attorneys were very clever at using other laws to make a RESPA violation something that they could sue for a private right of action. So the issue was now that suddenly we have a sea change, and wide-ranging views. Some were more, we'll have to wait and see, probably won't be as bad as some think, to some think it's the end of the world. I'm more in the let's see, it probably won't be as bad as people originally thought, and that's mainly because of the way truth in lending is structured. While there is liability for various disclosures, it's a very specific formula that truth in lending goes through. In particular, there's generally actual damages for any violation, but historically it's been very hard for consumers to establish actual damages based on courts' need for them proving detrimental reliance, but for some error in disclosure, they wouldn't have gone through the transaction and therefore were injured. Hard standard to meet. So where the liability usually comes is in the statutory damages, which are automatic. But those only apply to certain specific disclosures, and the statute's very specific as to which provisions have those statutory damages. Significantly, the various provisions under which the integrated disclosures were adopted and RESPA was added to the Truth in Lending regs isn't in that laundry list of items that have statutory damages. So it looks like while actual damages may be available, historically they've been hard for consumers to prove. But obviously the plaintiff's attorneys will test this area, and we'll have to wait and see what really happens. Moving on to some big issues operationally, the rule goes into effect this August 1, and it's for applications received on or after that date. And that's important for transitional issues, because if you take an application on July 31, that is stays in the good faith estimate HUD 1 environment. That could even be if it's an application for a loan on new construction, which may not close sometime until 2016. You will still be closing that loan using the HUD-1. So it'll be very important during a transitional phase to coordinate whether a loan is in the GFE HUD-1 structure or whether the loan is in the loan estimate closing disclosure structure based on when the application was received. Because the way it is, the disclosures, the loan estimate and the closing disclosure under the new rule are intended to be used together. So you'd never have a case where GFE was issued and then the closing disclosure was used to close the loan. So that's a transitional item that people need to take account of. And also there'll probably be a continuing need for various people to keep being able to operate both in the truth in lending, good faith estimate, truth in lending HUD-1 environment, because reverse mortgage loans for now stay in the old or existing disclosures. Also, people often use the good faith estimate and truth in lending for HELOCs, and that will probably continue. Now, another big operational issue is really taking assessment of how you're going to receive loan applications. The real challenge here is what the Bureau did is they removed from the definition of application, which triggers your need to issue the loan estimate in 3 business days, what we call the so-called catch-all, which is anything the loan originator deems necessary. So now, 6 very minimal pieces of information will constitute an application, and it's simply the borrower's name, income, their Social Security number to obtain the credit report, the property address, an estimate of the value, and an estimate of the loan amount. That's it. Once those 6 items appear, you have an application and a loan estimate must be issued. Note what's missing from that even. Loan product isn't even on the list. The Bureau has suggested that what lenders can do is sequence information. In other words, as they request information, perhaps leave elements that constitute an application towards the end of the questioning process. Nonetheless, however, they're going to go out and perform customer and consumer awareness and let them know that if you hand a loan originator, which could be a creditor or a broker, these specific 6 items of information, you must receive a loan estimate. So folks really need to inventory today how they take applications. Is it direct person-to-person, on phone, online? Online, actually, that may need to be reprogrammed. Do you accept from brokers? Key there, they did allow a broker to issue a loan estimate. There's some gray areas they haven't answered there, but key is if a broker issues a loan estimate and identifies the creditor that they're working with, that creditor is responsible for that loan estimate as if the creditor had issued itself. That's causing a lot of creditors now to decide on how they're going to receive applications. Will they allow, if they take applications from brokers, fine, they may do that, but they're going to decide, will the broker be allowed to issue the loan estimate, or will the creditor really undertake that function? And whichever way you go, there's going to have to be good communication between the creditor and the broker to make sure everyone knows basically the facts that the consumer did provide, and in particular that the creditor's loan programs, fees, and costs are all accurately represented in that loan estimate, and that's whether either the creditor or the broker prepares it. So that's another thing. How are you going to take applications? And really, folks need to do inventories of how they do that today and pay particular attention to online programs because those are probably going to need to be revised and assessed. Now, another thing folks are looking at, what I'm seeing a lot of lenders today that will continue to engage in wholesale, they're leaning, if not have decided, that they're actually going to issue the loan estimate themselves, though they'll be coordinating greatly with the brokers in doing so. One interesting aspect of that is looking at the RESPA implications, where HUD in the past created guidance, which has moved over to the Bureau now, that if a broker performs various functions, then they can get paid by the lender. One of those functions is issuing the upfront disclosures. If that's taken off the plate of brokers, that's one less function they'll be performing. However, that may be offset by other aspects. In particular, there's going to need to be a lot of hand-holding of borrowers to make them move expeditiously to get information in and to have a timely closing, and we'll touch on the importance of that in a moment. And since the broker's on the ground really working with the consumer, they may take on behalf of the creditor, more of that role in really, hand-holding or prodding, if you will, using a politer word, the borrower to make decisions, get information back. So something we need to look at, the RESPA implications of that, but it does show this rule has a number of tangents. Now, one important thing here is the closing and moving to closing and the importance of having information earlier than before. The rule requires that the consumer have in their hands at least 3 business days before closing the closing disclosure, which has all the truth in lending and RESPA disclosures in it. We're somewhat used to today of having to prepare a truth in lending, final truth in lending disclosure early if the APR moves by a certain amount and get that into the consumer's hand 3 business days before closing. That's not so with the HUD-1. That document is usually coming off the printer at the closing table. There's often a one-day pre-advance inspection. There is a one-day pre-advance inspection requirement. Borrowers rarely ask to see it in advance.
Can you guys mute your lines because we're getting some feedback from some noise? Sorry, Richard.
That's okay. So it's a new paradigm where really working with the closing agent, whoever they are, and sharing information to get that closing disclosure in the consumer's hands. Now, again, this is one where they shift. Today, the settlement agent is responsible for the HUD-1. That responsibility for the borrower's closing disclosure has been shifted to the lender. The lender is allowed to let the settlement agent issue the closing disclosure, but the lender remains responsible. Number of lenders we're seeing where I think a lot of them are going to fall in place is they're going to issue the closing disclosure themselves. But that doesn't mean the settlement agent isn't involved. They will be very much involved, and there will be much communication between lenders and closing agents to get this document prepared and in the consumer's hand. And importantly here, this is going to involve managing expectations, particularly for consumers who've closed loans before, and particularly consumers who've done purchase money loans. They're used to, many cases, even at the closing table, renegotiating the deal with the seller. And that's provided, caused problems in the past. Now consumers are going to have to be known that if I don't have all the facts and if the deal isn't set in stone this many days before closing, you're going to risk closing on time. So this is going to be a management issue with borrowers, sellers, real estate agent, and brokers, educating them that the rules have changed. No more last-minute deals, because if there is a last-minute deal, we may have to delay the closing. And in fact, even after you put out the closing disclosure, if various significant changes occur, a revised closing disclosure must be issued with a new 3-day waiting period. So for purchase money transactions, obviously, it's going to be very important to make sure that the borrower and the seller know they really can't do it the way it's been done before. And that's going to be a significant operational issue in managing those expectations. Last thing I point, the record-keeping requirements are changing and they're extensive, and this presents some various operational issues because it's not just a retain copies of the documents requirement, it's retain evidence of compliance with all aspects of the rule. So for instance, if fees change from the original loan estimate and you issue a revised loan estimate, you'll have to maintain records to prove there was indeed a change. That change supported increasing the fees that you did increase, and from when you learned of the change, you timely issued a loan estimate within 3 business days in order to appropriately increase those fees, and you'll have to retain evidence of all of that. In many cases, the loan officer on the front line will be the one who's receiving that information, and they're going to really have to be trained to make sure they get information to support the change, make sure they take notes to provide background, make sure that all gets into your system so that you can prove this in an examination or in a lawsuit that, in fact, you did everything appropriately. And it's a 3-year period. Probably people will retain things longer for various other requirements, but that is another significant operational issue that I wanted to point out. With that, that concludes my initial comments. Looking forward for our discussion a little further as we move on. But Roberta, now hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. that was very, very enlightening. And what I'd like to do is go on to my presentation, which I hopefully will go up on the screen. And my, let's see, end of slideshow. Here we go. I'll go to slideshow. Just bear with me. This is, my background is operations. So what we've been able to do is look at some of the really key things that lenders are going to have to look at and analyze prior to August 1st, and much prior to August 1st. The Truth in Lending Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act implementation is really a paradigm shift in the mortgage industry, and it's going to cover everything from sales to servicing. So as Richard said, it's now a matter of collecting data and having data from when the loan officer or person on the sales desk or on the internet leads. It covers the entire process. It's effective for new mortgage applications taken on or after August the 1st. And as Richard said, there are some exceptions, HELOCs, reverses. These are not covered under the regulations. The disclosures must be made and quote unquote in good faith to the consumer. And that means that they have to be correct. They have to be accurate. And the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is specific in stating that the disclosures must be made in good faith. Disclosures are also transaction-centric. So each loan is going to be specific as to the terms of that loan. So what we have now is a truth in lending and a good faith estimate that is sort of generic to the product. But effective August 1st, each of the disclosures are going to be loan-centric. So you need the ability to identify your products and programs. So your disclosure for an ARM is going to be very different than your disclosure for a fixed rate. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau expectations are very high for the creditor compliance. They're expecting, compliance basically is what they're expecting. What I would, if I was back in operations, how I would approach this is take it in various steps for the implementation plan. And the first step that I would suggest would be to identify your staff that will comprise the implementation plan team. And the team should be made up of folks from compliance, from credit, from operations, from IT, from sales, and from management. So an initial group that hopefully you all have this in place, or you're going to put something like this in place as soon as possible, would be representatives from these areas of the creditor's team. Now, there's also, you need to identify third-party service providers. And of course, that would be the loan operating systems, closing agents, appraisers, if you use any affiliates, compliance software vendors. I know lots of folks use separate software for their HMDA reporting, as well as for QM compliance. You need to bring them into the fold to make sure that they are on board with these new regulations. The correspondents and the brokers, they are definitely involved as third-party service providers because they're providing the loans. What I want to also add to this list is realtors, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the real estate industry, real estate leaders at the end in the last slide, but they definitely need to be part of this this implementation plan. There's a tremendous learning curve that is going to be involved in with lenders. The team, once you've created the team, you need to begin to assess the ability for an August 1 rollout. Will you be ready? Will you be able to generate the new disclosures in good faith? Will your staff be able to meet the challenge? The team that you create should begin to prepare the draft of the implementation plan, which will include the budget projections, transition operations, and the timeline. What we suggest, what we use here is what's called a tracker for looking at the various milestones of completion and how far along we are in our completion of the task. So definitely you need a timeline to see how much you've done, what's behind you, and what's ahead of you. You also need to prepare a plan to handle the existing pipeline. There's a lot of our clients who have bloated pipelines that consist of loans that are kind of hanging out there, loans that are classified as prospects. You don't want to carry over this existing pipeline into the August 1 rollout. So as part of the operations preparation, you need to prepare for the existing pipeline, as well as Richard mentioned, loans taken, applications taken July 31st, because you're going to be working with two systems, with two separate LOS systems, LOS capabilities. In order to look at your operation, you really need a gap analysis. Now, a gap analysis is an assessment of where you are currently operationally and where you want to be in connection with the requirements of the Bureau. What you do is compare where you are, where you want to be, and look at the difference. And the difference is called a remediation plan. And the remediation plan is really the tasks that are ahead of you in order to be operational and compliant by August the 1st. So in looking at the learning curve, you need to look at the existing pipeline as well as a gap analysis. And if in the CFPB documentation, which all CFPB documentation is online, if you go to their website and they have all of their regulations and all of their guides, that they talk about a gap analysis. So that's one of the items that they are looking for lenders to have in their implementation plan. So if you just go to the implementation guide for CFPB, you'll see that a gap analysis is suggested very strongly. You use those remediation steps resulting from the gap analysis to introduce, what you want to do is get operational efficiency improvements throughout the origination and the closing processes, and identify a baseline of business requirements. What we used to call it when I was in secondary marketing, we would call it get your position. You need to know where you're at and where you're going and what steps you need to take to get yourself ready for the August 1st rollout. It's a very good tool. And from the remediation steps, you can develop the change management strategy, what you need to change, and identify potential risks from internal operations and third parties. So when you do the gap analysis, you're going to look at where are your weak spots in the process and what do you have to do to get them fixed. I want to talk a little bit about third-party service providers. And the CFPB is very clear on what they're looking for in terms of the creditors' use of third-party service providers. And as I mentioned earlier, they're the loan operating system, they're appraisers, they're all of the third-party service providers, other software vendors that you use. The creditor needs to clearly define what the service is going to be. That's your responsibility, to define what this third-party service provider is going to do. You also need records of service testing for compliance-related services. So if you're using a vendor for your LOS, which I'm sure all of you are, as well as other compliance-related services for QM compliance, HMDA reporting, you need to get records of their service testing. How often do they update the periodic product changes and updates that that vendor has? You need to have that record. What are they charging? What are their price schedules for their services? Now this is critical because when you start to put fees on the loan estimate and the closing disclosure, and I'm talking particularly about affiliates or appraisers, that can't change. So you need to be very clear as to what the costs are. When you start to do your third-party due diligence prior to the engagement and have a plan for ongoing periodic reviews and risk assessments. So part of the due diligence would be, are you obtaining their errors and omissions, copies of their errors and omissions insurance? Are you getting, in some cases, an SSAS 16, which is a review of the operations of a company? This is particularly critical when you're looking at your loan operating systems. And are you requesting information on other organizations to whom the third party provides services? Do you have a scorecard? Do you have the information that you, who else are they providing these services for? And you need to be aware of what their scorecard is. Also, the creditor needs to develop an oversight and review mechanism to assess the risks associated with these third-party service providers that should be part of the due diligence. What we've seen is that when the CFPB performs an audit on a particular institution, what they'll say is, okay, did you perform a review of the calculations used in the disclosures? And what we've seen is, in one case where our client went back to the CFPB with a response that said, well, we used this third-party service provider to provide this data to us, and the CFPB said, well, it's the creditor's responsibility. So if you are using a third-party service provider for this, it's your responsibility to verify that the information and the data is accurate. With third-party service providers, what should be part of the due diligence? They can cause you, there can be risks on your reputation, your compliance, and Rich talked about some of the, the huge responsibilities and fines and penalties that the CFPB can levy. Consumer harm, which the plaintiff's attorneys are just hoping happens, as well as monetary exposure to you as the lender. So with your you rely so much on the third-party service providers that you need to constantly assess their ability to provide accurate services.
Hey, Roberta?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to add something. The third-party service provider oversight is very important. The regulators, those of you that are with public institutions, the SEC, the PCAOB, the Institute of Internal Auditors, is really focused on third-party service providers. The growth in cloud and outsourced solutions is obviously everybody knows that's occurred, but that's really been the big focus of. Obviously, it's important for this, but it's also important for your external audit, for your regulatory audit, and for a whole host of matters. This is probably one of the bigger focuses the last couple of years has been on across a variety of regulatory bodies and so forth, third-party vendors. Sorry to interrupt. I thought I'd just add that.
Oh, thank you. That was Peter Schablik, our systems person. Thank you very much, Peter. And step 5 is looking at your policies and procedures. And this is the simplest way that I could put it, is that you're going to find it almost impossible to transition without revising your existing policies and procedures. And if you don't have up-to-date policies and procedures, you may have to delay originations or actually terminate certain products until you are up to date in your policies and procedures. Absolutely critical. And one of the other experiences that we've had is that folks have a lovely set of policies and procedures, and they have they're in binders, and they're just so pretty. And when the regulators come in, and this is the states as well as the CFPB, they will ask for the copy of the policies and procedures. And what they will do is they're going to match it against what is actually occurring within the processes of the organization. So when we talk to lenders, and I almost hesitate to say this, is that I'll say, if you went out into your branch system and looked at how loans are originated, would those processes in your branches match what's in your policies and procedures? And almost to a person, they'll say, no, they won't match. So I just can't stress enough that the need for the revisions of policies and procedures based on these new processes. Remember that lenders and creditors are financially liable for inaccurate disclosures. And another big point in the operations side is these new disclosures are actually going to reduce the loan origination cycle by 3 days. So in order to be able to move the loans through the pipeline into closing, since you have to allow 3 days prior to the loan closing to get the final closing disclosure out to the consumers, you're cutting your operations and your processing time by 3 days. So the other thing that I would say that everyone needs to revisit their rate lock policies, and how are they going to manage this shortened processing time. Also, when it comes to the closing disclosure, CFPB is very clear that there can only be under very extreme circumstances where the 3 days could be waived by the consumer. I say that, the 3 days, if you waive it, is the same as if a consumer waives the right of rescission. It's that critical that it not be done. We would never recommend that be part of a policy where you could waive the 3-day disclosure rule. And I would say that if you make a loan, you waive the 3 days, you better, really like that loan, because you're not going to be able to sell that loan anywhere. So that's going to be monitored very closely by the aggregators and by the investors. Step 6 would be employee readiness, the training and communications. We can't wait until July the 15th and put everybody in a room and talk about this and do training. This is not this type of thing, because it's a whole new change of process. So you have to have employee readiness, that the training should be step-by-step and comprehensive, equipping the staff with knowledge and skills required to operate within a compliant environment. The training should really cover everything that goes into these disclosures, because it's a whole different thing for a consumer to look at. Now, say a consumer gets the loan estimate and calls and notifies or contacts the individuals within your organization, and those individuals cannot answer the question of what does this mean, where does this come from, how is this calculated. The staff needs to know where these numbers are coming from. So you just don't want to get yourself into a situation where your staff cannot answer a question, and then a consumer files a complaint that they didn't understand, or they weren't, there wasn't good service or something. That's all. You don't need that. So your staff needs to understand in and out what these disclosures are, the sources of the data, and what each of the pieces of information on those forms mean. A communication plan should be, you need to have two. You need to have an internal communication plan, which again I suggest using a tracker that, okay, we meet, this is who's on the team, these are the people responsible, we're going to meet every other day, we're going to meet every day and update where we are in our implementation plan. Externally, if, and this is where I want to talk to, about the real estate industry, if you're going to need, lenders are going to need to reach out to the realtors, the real estate industry. And the sooner that you begin to reach out, the better. And I think it would position your company in terms of servicing the realtor community to let them know what these changes are. However, when the training is done, it should be done by, not by your sales staff, and it shouldn't be to the individual agents. It should be a company to company, led by a compliance person, because you don't want to get involved in having a meeting that is not, that has any relationship to sales or referrals of business. It has to be very clear that this is an informational meeting and it's going to be run not by your sales staff but by your compliance people or your management staff. This, I would say, is very, very important. One other thing I want to say, when we talk about third-party service providers with the loan operating systems, is what we've seen is in the major operating systems that are out there, that the reporting capabilities are not really great. And I don't want to focus on any particular company, but as you get data, and because it's almost like a fire hose of data coming out that you have to manage, is that what we've seen is that the LOS systems really don't have good reporting. And since you're condensing your processing time in order to meet the 3-day closing requirement, you really have to identify issues up front. So you don't want to put in, you don't want to go up against that 30-day Reg B rule if you cannot, without good data. So in looking at your LOS systems, if you're not satisfied with the reporting abilities, I would say look to either a supplemental system or something that is going to give you reporting ability. So I know Peter is going to talk about that, and that basically is the end of my presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter Schablik, who is a partner in the Boston office, and I'm going to see if I can connect him. Peter, I'm see if I can get this.
Yeah, I'm waiting here.
Are you on? I can't see. Lisa? Got it. Hold on.
You do? Okay.
I got it. And then go to your PowerPoint. Okay.
Hopefully you can see my screen. This is Peter Schablik. I'm a partner in the Boston office. Although I travel across the country, I work with Roberta extensively in the banking and the mortgage banking area. I think what Roberta said was a very good implementation approach, assessment approach. Technology is obviously a part of that. Technology would be throughout her discussion. Roberta mentioned several elements that are critical. For example, third-party service providers. As I mentioned, that's really been a hot topic in the industry, from the regulators, from the SEC, from the Internal Audit Association, from a number of perspectives. Obviously, it's very important for TILA-RESPA, but it's also important for financial reporting, regulatory compliance, and obviously, privacy, GLBA, and other requirements. So that's really a hot topic in the industry, and one it's been a big focus. The PCOB and the public company guidance really focused on that recently. So that's very important from a process technology perspective. One of the things that you got to think about, and it's come up in a number of these sessions, is understanding your organization. What drives your organization? From our experience, mortgage originators, mortgage banks, very sales focused. So sometimes it's difficult to get across the need to have these controls and compliance requirements in place. And it may be an approach to do it maybe piecemeal, or maybe gradually add this. what Roberta mentioned, we see a lot of our clients focusing on is putting in new systems to handle, new loan origination systems to handle this, but often they don't have the reporting capabilities. Tools that allow you to develop dashboards and really communicate to the front-end people, such as originators, what's missing. A very common concept in technology is correcting data at the source, not waiting to the underwriters get a loan application and 15 things are missing. What do we do? It's really correcting and controlling data at the source is really the best practice, across technology in general, technology projects. My background, I was with Anderson for many years, and then I was at a couple other places, and I've been with CohnReznick for 4 years. But I've been through the full system development, system lifecycle training at Anderson, and it's a lot of best practices that I'm going to talk about. And one of them is really correcting errors at the source, not waiting, not allowing problems to go downstream, whether it's banking, manufacturing, other financial services is a common theme. As I said, Roberta gave a good overview of the project, and technology would fit into her overall project methodology there. If we think backwards, planning backwards, August 1st, you have to be ready. Well, there's a lot to, as Roberta said, there's a lot that has to happen. You have to develop your strategy. You have to select or design new solutions. You have to develop or implement changes to your environment, for the forms, for the reports and so forth. You have to test. You have to train, and then there may be some, obviously a lot of documentation and maybe regulatory reporting. So July 15th is not a good starting date. Maybe January 15th is a good starting date to really get everything done on time and to make sure you're ready. I think a couple other things before I go into the details here is, a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the remaining slides here is not really a lot of new information. It's really, really things that have been in place in process for many years. A concept of straight-through processing is another technology thought, and that's essentially that's been around for again 20 years. I did a project years ago at MFS Financial. We put in a straight-through processing system or solution. The concept is you enter data once at the source and it flows all the way through. That's a little more of an integrated system approach. So some of what we're going to talk about is integrated, and some of it's going to be real point solutions. What do we need? We need this form from this application. We need this GFE. We need the TILA functionality, RESPA functionality. Those are point solutions, but we also have to think about integrated solutions, end-to-end type solutions. And we talk about technology again. It's really integrated to the kind of approach Roberta discussed. But we look at people, process, and technology when we talk about technology. Do we have the right people in the IT area? Do they have the right direction? Do they have the right oversight? Do those people establish the right policies? And as again Roberta said, we've done many times, we look at loan process reviews, loan audits, if you will. A lot of the problems are really, we have great policies, nobody's following them. There has to be oversight. There has to be some consequences if policies aren't followed. How do you know? How do you know what's happening? So in terms of, hopefully this slide works well here. Okay. What are the CFPB? I mean, it's no surprise the CFPB is going to look closely at your systems, your compliance management system, your automated systems for underwriting, and this is right from the CFPB manual. They expect significant system development. 6 months. That's what they say. 6 months. And the lenders can remain compliant while developing their system. So they anticipate this is, and again, if you think about it from evaluation, selection, implementation, testing, training. It's not a 1 or 2 week. It's not a 2 month. It's several month project, and it gets very complicated. This slide, really, as I talked about, there's a lot of point solutions. If you think about the loan origination process, we have new forms, new estimate deadlines, extracting data for calculation. I'm not going to go through every one of these points, but there's a lot of pieces. That has to occur here, here, here. That's what we refer to as point solutions, and that's where you have to look at your current systems. Can they handle this? Will the vendor update this? Do we have to program this ourselves? That's very important. And the other option, and the other way to look at it is really how are we integrated? And a lot of our clients are putting in Encompass, Vista, and some other solutions. And what they're really doing is they're taking an environment like this is many of our banks. This is more of a banking model than a mortgage origination, mortgage company. you got mortgage bot for loan applications or physical loan applications. They may have like a legacy system such as Easy Lender or Sound for origination system. They may have a separate system for HMDA reporting, and then maybe they want one of the core banking vendors for servicing, Fiserv, FIS, Jack Henry. Then they have a whole series of external vendors, as Roberta said, third party, evaluating third parties. You're doing CT Lean for UCC processing, Moody's for credit, CoreLogic real estate, and so forth. And that's just a partial list. We're saying, you may not think of them as technology vendors, but in effect they are. You're sharing data, the processing, giving you a result, and that feeds into your system. So they really are. This is just, again, it's just a partial list. You may have many more for appraisals and inspectors and so forth. But as you look at this, one of the challenges, and I'll go through the challenges, but you've got non-integrated systems, so there's a lot of reentry of information, and it's efficient, but it also poses the challenge of errors, data being dropped, all types of errors. Whereas, as you're going through this process, it's obviously a good time to think about: do we need to reconsider our loan origination system, and whether we need an end-to-end solution? Again, something such as Encompass or Vista can handle the front end to the back end, so you're not re-entering data multiple times. The next slide really, what are the issues with the current environment for many of our clients? Zero or near zero tolerance to the regulatory environment. Manual forms and interfaces are prone to error. Coordination of changes among systems. If I make a change in the servicing system, how does it affect origination? How does it affect the application, the front end? Again, inconsistencies, transposition errors, and even technical issues. Fields may not be mapped correctly. You may have different precision levels on your fields. From an inefficient standpoint, you're re-entering information multiple times. I've seen a situation where we've entered the same. How do you know you haven't uploaded the same file twice? If you don't really have that integration, you could actually have duplicate data in certain cases. One of the big concerns I've seen with non-integrated systems is Reg V filings. They can be very manual, and as Roberta said earlier, you can miss those. You can be late on your adverse action notices. And another concept in technology and process is having a process view of an area. If you have non-integrated systems, I'll just go back. I can look at the loan application system and see how many applications I have and what the status of the application, or I can see the loans, or I can see whatever. But I don't see the whole view. And what happens in that example from a customer service standpoint, if a customer calls and says, what's the status of my loan, it might not be so easy to determine, or something may be stuck up and held up in an area, and nobody's really responsible for it. We commonly see is if a lender hasn't provided some information, call them once, haven't provided it, the loan could sit in one place for weeks. Obviously, that's hard to detect that pipeline. Can't have a full pipeline reporting with non-integrated systems. So in terms of some of the things to think about as you're looking forward here, is technology, policies, compliance, and personnel. For technology, obviously we talked about this earlier. Do we build or outsource these new requirements? Do we put a new system in? Do we build it ourselves? Do we use a service provider? As Roberta discussed earlier, third-party vendors. We should evaluate their ability to deliver and determine whether they should be retained, or we should look at other solutions. Standardizing workflows, naming conventions. We've got a number of clients that have grown through acquisition. They've got multiple centers, multiple groups of people, and oftentimes they don't speak the same language. APR, or average daily balance, may mean 2 different things or 3 different things in 3 different people. Selecting the hardware and then making the software investments. And then obviously the challenge is making sure you have the loan origination solution notifications in place in the appropriate time. Again, I think I've talked about this, but some of the things to think about with your vendors: can they make the anticipated delivery date and when is the new forms going to be available? And again, as Roberta said, a great point Roberta had was, you want to have evidence that you've tested these changes. Either you or the vendor, if you've outsourced with the third party, has the third party done the testing and make sure these forms are operating correctly and accurate. Making sure you have the updates needed for legacy documents. evaluating a schedule, or evaluating the vendor schedule rather. Does the vendor have a schedule? Are they going to be on time? What are the contingencies? What if they don't make it? What are the that's going to be expected. You really have a lot of oversight in terms of third-party vendors. And then preparing training materials for August 1st. Those are the essential elements. Roberta's covered the others. From the lender, to policies, procedures, do we have a cutover strategy? As discussed earlier, do we clear out bad, stale information? Do we close loans we can? Do we clean things up? So we do go through this conversion. We're not converting a lot of loans in process or pending loans. Establish monitoring procedures, and this is something we're seeing more and more of. You know, these systems are very, some of them, I should say, loan origination systems have very good transaction controls and flow, but often they don't have the reporting capabilities. We see a lot of our clients using analytical tools and dashboards to, let's say, when an originator signs on in the morning, they have a dashboard that says, these are the loans that are missing information. These are the things you have to focus on. That's critical to, again, to really get data validation, data corrections at the source, and not wait till the loan's ready to close on the underwriter or in the underwriter's hands. Hey, you're missing 15 things. The right answer is to push that to the beginning of the stream to make sure that data is accurate and complete. And there are tools to do that, both from a monitoring as well as a dashboard reporting, and as something should be considered. And determining, you know, making sure. The other thing here is certainly challenges. You want to make sure that doesn't impact your mortgage production flow. So what I was suggesting is something that may be more palatable for a sales-focused organization is to provide that dashboard and analytics at the front end of the process. Instead of hitting the process with a hammer, you're really just really putting something in place that's much more acceptable to most people. In terms of lender decisions, yes.
Peter, can
yes.
I just add to that, and I think your point is well taken. When the organization, when the lender looks at the cost to originate the loan, which is one of the metrics that a lot of our clients use, a cost per unit to originate the loan. If you have the data that you're able to manage the data in the loan process correctly and accurately, your cost per unit is going to be very effective. It will be easily manageable. So you're cutting back on the time and the cost that it takes to originate the loan if you have correct data. So some of our clients that work to a cost per unit, this is going to help you in terms of your reporting. Look to your reporting capabilities to be able to manage your costs. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cost, customer service, compliance. You're absolutely right. It addresses all those types of issues. You're right. In terms of compliance and controls, obviously, lender has identified organizational technical risks. Again, managing third parties and developing mitigating controls. You know, obviously, again, this kind of repetitive a little bit, but you know, we are data integrity, error resolution, and so forth. The personnel change management strategy. You know, if you do, one of the areas Roberta and I have worked on is process maps, process decomposition, really documenting the flow of information through an organization. If you really take a step back and really evaluate what the roles and responsibilities are for people in the organization, you do require more of a change management strategy, how to communicate the change, how to train people, and you know, how to make sure the roles are clearly defined. And then the last thing I want to talk about really is monitoring. As I said before, data analytic tools. Well, monitoring, there's a lot of technology now that's available for monitoring changes, monitoring events. Given the high volume of some of these your organizations and the number of potential changes, it's often more efficient to think about monitoring rather than providing segregation of duties and limit who can change what, and looking at detailed reports. So that's one of the. I should have started with that a minute ago, but you know, and historically, you know, if something's changed or approvals in this industry, we've relied upon very detailed reports, new loans, changes, and so forth. Well, you know, with data analytics and monitoring, you can really look at the key elements that change, and not focus, not focus on the forest, but focus on a tree in the forest instead of the whole forest. You can actually filter down to what's really important. Well, that's essentially it for technology. I think, Roberta, did you want to open this up for questions at this point?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Rich. And, we should have really stopped in between. It's not snowing here, but I think I have snow in my brain. We should have stopped in between our presentations to ask if there's any questions. And we do have the ability for a conference call with our attendees. So is there any questions that you want to ask us? Don't be shy. I guess
hey,
one
Roberta,
of the, go ahead, I'm sorry.
This is Peter. Hey, Roberta, what's going to happen to the organizations that aren't ready? I mean, some aren't going to.
Rich, do you want to jump in and talk about that?
Sure. I'm glad to do that. Yeah, this is one unfortunately, I was getting a lot last year, a lot of folks saying because of how much needed to be done that, the Bureau is going to delay the rule. And when I was doing often presentations with Bureau staff that were included in the panel, I'd start off and saying, guys, that it's going effective August 1. And I go, now we might get like we did leading up to the January 2014 implementation of all the Dodd-Frank rules, where in October, CohnReznick came out and gave a general statement that, look, if you're working in good faith to implement all this, we know it's a lot, and we're not going to be, sticklers down to the nth degree because we understand. But it was by no means a delay, and so people really needed to be well on their way in implementing the rules. I think that at this point is probably the best we would see out of the Bureau. And in particular, what happened is when I made comments that there's not going to be a delay, the staff, CFPB staff said, yeah, we just want to jump in here and confirm that. Yeah, the director said it's going effective August 1. So I think at best we're looking at is maybe that good faith, diligent efforts to implement. Maybe they won't be down to the nth degree right off the bat in examinations, but I think it's something that, even though they're somewhat concerned that the software providers are coming out later than usual, I still think they're going to expect the industry to be substantially compliant, and those that are not, particularly since mortgage companies are under the supervisory authority of the Bureau, I think it's going to be a focus during their examinations, and the examination won't go well, I think, if they're not doing well here. So that's one, and I see the administrative end of it being the most immediate and direct effect on companies. And then we're also worried that the plaintiff's Spahr is going to test the water. And what they usually do is they try to go out and find different targets to launch an attack on. And usually they go for the smaller companies, figuring they would have a less rigorous defense, and that they could then get a court decision that was favorable for the plaintiffs, unfavorable for the industry, and then take those decisions and file more suits against the industry. So it's going to be something where it's going to be important to be in the best shape you can come August 1. Obviously, will we be as good as we will be a couple years down the road? No. We saw that with the January 2010 implementation of the changes to the RESPA disclosures. But the Bureau, so far from what I've seen, is viewing this, it's going effective August 1, and we expect you to be compliant.
Thank you, Rich. What I'd like to do is go around the table, our virtual table, and ask our participants where they're at in their planning processes and in their implementation processes. And who wants to start?
I mean, I'll just say that we are in the process of kicking off our implementation program and plan. We're having our very first formal meeting this week with our operational, lending operational staff, along with compliance, of course, to get things started.
Charles?
Yes.
What operating system are you using? I know you're a bank.
Yeah, our loan operating system is Encompass, which we've been on for about a year at this point.
Okay. Okay. They have a very large market share, so they're you know, I guess it depends on when they can get the deliverable out to you guys.
Exactly.
Who else wants to volunteer to see where they're at? Thank you, Charles.
Sure.
This is Doug Dillon from Industrial Bank. We are similarly at an early stage. This phone call is a little bit of a wake-up call, quite frankly. But you know, we are transitioning. We're actually in the process of trying to transition from Mortgage Bot and Calyx Point to Encompass. So that's one thing that we'll be developing during the course of the year. But really, we are just beginning to get our arms around all this, and I think you know, we'll probably have to meet on a weekly basis to implement all of this by August 1st. So, well, prior to August 1st, actually. So that's kind of where we are.
Okay, I appreciate your comments, Douglas. Who else wants to jump in?
Hi, this is Judy Blank.
Hi, Judy.
Hi. I mean, I've spent, you know, a fair amount of time reading so that I can, you know, get a handle on things and start to ask the right questions and have a, I guess, a overview in my mind of where we go so that I can present this to everybody else, feeling that I have to be, you know, the lead on this. You know, without, you know, some in-depth reading and attending other meetings and calls, you know, you don't even know what the questions are yet. And once you start asking the questions, they beget other questions. I think the timeline for the readiness of the origination system, and we're also on Encompass, is going to be critical so that we can do sufficient testing, because presenting that and training others on that is going to be highly important. And having, you know, being able to react to the issues that are, you know, in all fairness, are going to be there, but able to work them out in sufficient time so that we don't have some of the, you know, the issues that we ran into, you know, last year at this time. So.
Appreciate it, Judy. Who else wants to raise their hand? Well, I have a question that, and this is brought up in a lot of our meetings, is that regarding the three-day closing, and I'll direct this to you, Rich. And let's do a real practical example. The closing disclosure has been delivered to the closing agent, and there at the closing table there becomes an issue of credit for an oil tank or an oil in a tank. Does that require a new closing disclosure and a 3-day wait? If there's a credit like that that comes up at closing?
Yeah, and this was an issue in particular that came up in the proposed rule, where the original proposal was from the Bureau was relatively modest changes, not only required a new closing disclosure but a new waiting period. And the industry was fairly uniform in its comments that that might not be consumer protection, actually, because if you have to delay a closing for more modest changes, that can have significant, particularly in a purchase transaction, as you mentioned, very significant implications on the consumer who's the buyer, the consumer who's the seller, and then if that seller's turning around and buying another home, you could get the domino effect, and you could have to, people have to get hotel rooms, people have to, reschedule movers, and a lot of this, which is money, over. And one of the changes, if the amount changed by $100, that was the original proposal. So the industry was fairly uniform in pointing out to the Bureau that actually you're probably not doing consumers a favor if you have requirements that would trigger a new disclosure and a new waiting period. Just revising disclosure wasn't viewed as much of an issue because that, in some cases, could be done quickly, but it's the 3-day waiting period that was really viewed as being a significant issue. What they decided to do was identify 3 types of things that would require not only the new disclosure but the new waiting period. One was they followed the existing rule that's in place for having to issue a revised truth in lending disclosure that the borrower must receive at least 3 business days before closing, and that's if the APR becomes out of tolerance. And the statutory provision there is actually more flexible than the industry standard used by investors. The industry standard generally is if the APR moves up or down by more than 1/8 of 1%. Generally, industry practice will be to issue that new truth in lending, even if the statute would allow you not to do so. What we're going to have to see is, will investors enforce that same narrower standard on the closing disclosure? I have a feeling they might, so we might be in that same environment. But obviously, an 1/8 of a percent APR change probably is not going to be affected like, as you said, a credit for oil. That it's really going to be a part of the loan transaction that would be changing. The other 2 things are, one is the loan program itself changes. That viewed as probably being fairly remote. And the third is being a prepayment fee is added, and prepayment fees have pretty much been legislative out of existence in general. So the real determinant here is whether the APR moves a lot, and generally that's not going to be changed by the various seller and buyer credits for taxes and those things, because those are really off APR items. There would be a need to update the closing disclosure, but I don't think anyone would delay a closing for that type of thing.
That's, I think, a question that's come up, and I appreciate your response to that. Is there any other issues that you folks?
Yeah, I'd like to see if you can delve a little bit more into, we were talking about the implementation and the teams, and specifically on the third-party side with the, I guess, involvement and interaction with the settlement agencies. Could you talk a little bit more about that and the impacts and what we need to be considering now that's different from before? Or I should say different with the new implementation?
Well, I'll start. What the creditor, the lender, is responsible for the closing disclosure and for the preparation of the closing disclosure. There's been a couple of, and then Rich, you can jump in, there's been a couple of discussions with the major lenders, the one being Wells and the other one B of A. Wells originally came out and said that they would prepare the closing disclosure. And I think what they've done is they've backtracked a little because what they've done is they said, okay, closing agents, settlement agents, we know that there's certain data on that closing disclosure that we may not have. That being, for example, an adjustment for water and sewer or an adjustment for taxes or something. So Wells has the final authority, but they may have delegated it out to preparation of that to settlement agents.
Well, one of the things, Roberta,
Go ahead.
Also, Roberta, I was going to add one of the things that kind of is common right now and viewed by the regulators is, you can outsource tasks to third parties. You can't outsource responsibility. So the accurate production of the report, really you are still responsible for making sure forms or reports are accurate. And what that means, and I think what it means, Roberta, is that you have to make sure you understand the development, design, testing, and oversight for any third-party solutions. So you're still responsible. You just may not produce it, but because what's happened in a lot of third-party vendors is, some organizations have tried to outsource responsibility. Oh, they handle it. We're done. Oh, not. They don't want to hear that. They want to know what kind of oversight plan you have in place.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
So I think, go ahead, Rich. And then we can talk about the B of A solution where they've outsourced part of it. But again, they're responsible. B of A is responsible. The creditor is responsible for the contents and delivery of the closing disclosure. Rich, do you have any comments?
Yeah, and Janel, one thing I did want to, one thing that following up on what Peter said in terms of the delegating, what I say, there's a difference between delegation and abdication, and it's definitely in the past it's been abdication. So you handle it, I'm not involved, and that, believe me, that's not the approach you can take with the bureau. It's and that's or any of the banking regulators now. They're keenly focused on service providers, and so that's going to be very important. One of the big things here, and eventually what this is leading to is probably a lot of people, and I mentioned one gentleman mentioned they had moved to Encompass from an older system, and that's what a lot of people were doing. Some were doing it in general because these older systems that were built on closed architecture didn't have the MISMO standards or any of that. It was becoming increasingly difficult to do business with other people because systems didn't talk to one another without significant, programming to enable that to happen, and that was requiring a lot of manual reentry of data. That's where errors occur. That's where things get slow. And now here we have a more truncated origination process because you've got to get this closing disclosure done much earlier than before, and it's a very detailed disclosure. And you have to communicate on the front end maybe with brokers and other people, and then on the back end with the closing agents and other parties. And sometimes you might have a title company and a separate closing attorney, and so you're really coordinating with a couple different people. And it's going to be important eventually for anyone involved in closing to have systems that could talk to one another, probably built to the MISMO standards, so people more moving to Encompass and other well-used platforms that particularly can talk to one another. This is going to be very important because we're not going to have time to spend trying to get systems to coordinate with one another or manually re-entering information because that's when errors are going to occur, and that's going to slow us down, and you're going to make mistakes and not get to closing. So this is viewed as probably one of the significant, biggest operational challenges facing the industry, and it's made worse by a change the Bureau made that at first didn't give us what the industry what they wanted, but they did something that is driving the technology companies absolutely crazy. What they did is, you remember, you go back to the old days prior to the current GFE and HUD-1 where everything was itemized. The new GFE and HUD-1 went to more of a bundling approach, less itemization, more combined. The Bureau went back to more of an itemized approach. But they also made some big changes in how fees are disclosed. What they did is instead of the current method where with the GFE and HUD-1 there are very specific fields for specific fees, so you know this line has this fee and you could program your system that way knowing that line has that fee in it. They went to an approach of sections with major sections where you put different types of fees, but only very few dedicated lines for specific fees. Otherwise, what you do is you then list the fee by section alphabetically, and then if it's a title or closing fee, you put a prefix title dash, and then alphabetically. Well, the trouble is there is no industry convention as to how you call different fees. The same fee might be called an origination fee, an administration fee, an application fee, or a processing fee. And it's all the same fee. It may depend on the entity, and it may depend on the state involved. This is causing a huge problem now in designing first how you get fees over from the loan estimate to the closing disclosure, and then how do you calculate the APR, the finance charge, the points and fees, because you no longer have dedicated lines that the system can look to, pull those fees out and do these calculations. And then if you're dealing with different people with different systems now, it's further exacerbating the problem. So in talking with the technology people, what seemed the Bureau thought was a minor change is taking, they say, most of their staff's time in programming how to do this. And that's going to be a significant thing to focus on, because just when you do your APR and points and fees and other calculations and people to go to double check, you can't go to specific lines anymore. You really have to look at the name of the fee, understand what that fee is, then understand the treatment of the fee. This is going to make compliance a lot harder going forward.
Excellent. Excellent point. Excellent point. Is there any other issues in terms of where, what you're thinking of, where you're at, where you want to go, timing, any other issues from the floor?
I have some questions about the closing disclosure.
Sure.
I know if the closing disclosure is provided in person, you have the 3-day rule applies. If not, the mailbox rule applies. So that obviously extends the time. What about e-disclosures?
E-disclosures?
Or
for the closing disclosure?
Yes.
E-disclosure.
Yeah, if you present the closing disclosure as e-signed.
And actually, the way it will work in terms of delivery, you're right. The rule sets up a couple basic rules. There's in-person delivery is deemed receipt with in-person delivery. Delivery by any other method, then really it's two approaches, and the rule only specifies the details as to one. One is, as you noted, it's the mailbox rule, and however you send it, whether you send it electronically, by courier, regular mail, it's a deemed receipt 3 business days after you send it, or if you have proof of earlier actual receipt, then it's actual receipt. Now, what the rule doesn't do is define actual receipt. They leave that up to general standards of evidence. And they do say they realize, the Bureau actually recognizes that a lot of people probably will use electronic methods. They note with email that you would have to follow e-sign, or with any other electronic method you'd have to follow e-sign. And they also note that it should be done in a secure method. Where I think the industry eventually will move to is probably using secure web portals where the consumer agrees to see it there. You tell them it's there, they have a password, they go in, they access the document, and you can timestamp that they actually accessed it. I think that's where a lot of people are going to move to. Some will also use the secure email approach and just making sure they have a way to confirm that the consumer accessed the document. That can get into more complex issues. How do you know they really saw it, or if it's sent to an email address with multiple people, how do you know the right person saw it? That's why that gets into some issues. But what they really did is said you could rely on deemed receipt, or if you have evidence of actual receipt sooner than that, you could rely on that. There, what I expect is, as we've seen with a lot of the new rules, where you get into these areas where the rule itself doesn't specify operationally what the appropriate procedure is, in the end, the investors step in and say, this is what we would expect to see in the file as evidence of something. I suspect here investors may specify, when you're sending a document by email, secure email, or other method, what type of evidence they're going to expect you to have in the file to demonstrate when the borrower received it, and that will be something they'll check when they purchase the loan. So this is a case where I think, again, the investors will effectively become the rule writers in some cases by specifying what types of evidence they will want to see for proving when the borrower got the closing disclosure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Does the consumer still need to sign an e-signature disclosure or an acceptance of e-signature?
Yeah, actually, neither of the documents, while with an acknowledgement is allowed with both of the documents, it is not required. And in fact, that is part of the dynamic version of the forms. What they either have is they have a, if you decide to have it signed, there is a specific confirmation statement you must include, which is really simply a confirmation of receipt, but not indicating that they're necessarily bound by anything. Because remember, with the closing disclosure, they're getting this before closing now. So even if they do sign it, they're simply signing to confirm receipt. If you decide not to have them sign it, then you would take that off, but you'd have to put a separate disclosure in that indicates simply by receiving the document doesn't mean they're bound to the transaction. What I expect a lot of the industry will do is, because borrowers hardly ever sign the upfront documents and return them, a lot of people nowadays don't have them sign the upfront documents simply because they don't want to put a signature line on something that's rarely signed. So I think the upfront documents probably people will not have them signed unless they're delivered in person. The closing disclosures, though, I think industry standard will be to have that signed at the closing table, and they'll rely on some other evidence. Either they'll rely on the mail-rocks rule or other evidence to indicate that the borrower got it beforehand, but they're not going to probably rely on the borrower's signature because they may not, even though they get it, let's say, today, and they access it today, they may not get around to signing it till tomorrow, and you wouldn't want to have that because that would then cloud the issue as to when they got it. So I think in the end, the industry will only have people sign things at the closing table to confirm, in fact, simply that they did see the document, and probably there'll be some document there they might sign to confirm earlier receipt.
Okay. Did you have another question on closing?
I did. I have two more. Page 4 requires the creditor to put down the servicing practice regarding receipt of partial payments. If you typically, sell your loans, when they're purchased, is it your servicing practice for partial payments, because we do sometimes receive the first payment, or do you have to know the intended servicers?
Right. Here you'll be indicating what your practice is. It appears what they thought of is, in understanding that there may be a transfer to a servicer, is the periodic statement does have information as to partial payment practices, and I think that's what the Bureau intended to account for this situation, so that here you'll be indicating what your practice is, even though you really may not service it at all or may just take one payment. And then when the new servicer receives it, through the disclosures they provide, that will indicate their partial payment practices.
Okay, thank you. That makes life easier.
Sure.
Okay. And one more thing. Is there a database, if we have to check the licenses for the closing disclosure for the title, the settlement agents and the realtors, instead of relying on what they provide, is there a known database to check these on?
Boy, this is one thing that I've heard a lot of industry people are mentioning, and will it ultimately lead to something more of like the NMLS, but for other licensing classes? This may well prompt that to occur, because not that I know of now, unless there's a private one I'm not familiar with. I have a feeling what we were seeing is a lot of the states in general, once the NMLS was around and they had this system and this database for mortgage licenses, started getting the idea, why don't we do this for other state licenses as well? So we're seeing a movement in states to, in fact, start moving other licenses into an MLS-type database. They might even use the NMLS and just expand it. The states are working on that now. So I wouldn't be surprised in the future if the MLS or something like it didn't exist for all types of major licenses that would include title and such. The real estate, I just put a question mark by that, because if the real estate community decides they don't want that, they're usually pretty good at getting stopping legislation they don't want. So they may be the one that are treated a little differently. But I have a feeling title and other type of licenses ultimately will gravitate into an MLS type structure.
You know, there is a suggestion that we have on the third-party service providers. When you get the closing protection letter, that you verify that the individuals or individual names in the closing protection letter is in fact it's valid. I was an expert witness in a case where the closing protection letter had been forged. So that would be part of a due diligence on a third-party service provider regarding closing protection letters and closing agents. Well, we're at 9:30. We have time for one more question, and then is there another question that we can help you with? Well, then I think again our CohnReznick here. We really appreciate your participation, and that I know we had to change this around a couple times, but we were concerned with the weather in D.C. And we didn't want to. You know, we wanted you guys to be safe. And again, we can't thank Rich Andreano enough for your insight. Again, it was a rare opportunity for our participants to get this information from him. And we are going to follow up with, we're going to send all of the participants hard copies of the presentations. And if there's anything else that we can help you with or questions, you'll have our contact information. And again, I really appreciate your time today. And again, thanks to Rich, thanks to Peter. Peter, do you want to say a final word?
Thanks for attending. Obviously, if you have questions or want any follow-up, you know, any one of us would love to talk to you. I think Roberta, I think you're going to provide them, anybody who wants copies of the presentations for their own use. Thank you again. Thank you for attending, and good luck with your projects, initiatives.
And again, thank you, Rich. It's been invaluable.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. All right, everyone, have a good day.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.